Perfect. Thank you so much for attending. So I'm Raj. I'm the practice lead of Behavioral Science Insights at Fresh Squeezed Ideas. And today what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a case study we conducted where we compared our insights and strategies that were born out of more traditional market research methods compared to those born out of behavioral economics or behavioral science-based methods. So what we know and what we think is that traditional research tends to elicit rationalizations and not motivations, and we've heard the two previous speakers talk about this as well. And the reason for this is not because people are dishonest, but there's so many things that influence our decisions that we're not even aware of, and so we're unable to speak to. So to illustrate this, what I'm going to go over is this very simple decision of what to have for dessert later in the evening. And what we've done at Fresh Squeezed Ideas is we've taken a whole host of biases, of cognitive heuristics and shortcuts that we use to make our decisions on a day-to-day basis. Because we make so many of them, it's really not possible to fully logically and rationally work through each of those decisions. So there's all of these shortcuts that we take, and what we've done is we've distilled these into what we call 7 subconscious drivers of human behavior. So, for example, if you're making this decision as to what to have for dessert, you're choosing between orange slices or an ice cream. If we ask you in the morning, which one of these do you intend to have for dessert? You might say the orange slice because at that time you're full, this is far away, you're feeling kind of optimistic, and you want to be healthy that day. However, when it comes time to actually make that decision, if you're feeling hungry, you're more likely to choose the ice cream cone. And so this is something called the hot-cold empathy gap, where we're not really good at estimating the impact of physiological states. So these are things like being hungry, being tired, or being emotionally aroused on our decision-making. And so often what our intentions are, we don't follow through because we haven't taken into account these physiological need states. We also know that, unfortunately, our memories are not the best, so we can't just look back to what happened last time. There's lots of things that make our memories skewed, but for one example, if you're kind of leaning towards you feel like eating the ice cream, if you search back into your memory for your previous experiences eating the ice cream, your memory's going to confirm what you already want to do. So you might think about, yeah, all the previous times you've had ice cream and it tasted so good and you were satisfied, you felt really great about it. But what you're going to recall less is, the few times maybe that you've had a stomach ache after eating the ice cream. So it's this type of confirmation bias. Very simply, change is really hard. If you tend to eat ice cream for dessert every day, it's likely that you're going to continue to make that same choice, and that's because making the same choice requires less cognitive resources than going down a new path and making a new decision. The next thing is that choices are based on relative and not absolute evaluations. We have a very hard time judging something in absolute terms. We need some relative comparisons, and we tend to compare products. So, for example, in this decision here, if in the morning you were going to make the decision between the orange and the ice cream, you come home, it seems like your partner's eaten the orange, and now you're deciding between ice cream, cake, and a chocolate bar. Ice cream actually seems like the healthiest option. So the set from which you're considering will also have a big impact on what your decision is. Again, context really matters. So things in our environment influence us more than we would like to think, but if it's a sunny day, you're probably more likely to go for the ice cream versus if it was a cloudy day. We're very social animals, and so we like to fit in, and we also like to copy other people. So when we copy other people, this is basically because that other people have made that decision is offering some social proof that it is a good decision with a decent outcome. But we also just want to fit in, so if all of our friends are eating ice cream, we'll also go ahead and eat the ice cream. Lastly, we're not very good at evaluating the economic value of something. And so ownership of something or making the choice or decision to purchase that thing in the past will make us value that product more than something that is, objectively fairly equivalent. So with all of these biases and heuristics, what we know is that these are not things that people can easily recognize and so speak to. So using direct line inquiry research, where we just ask them, we're not going to actually get at the true motivations. We're going to get more towards rationalizations. So what we've done is we've built some principles that we use for our research that take into account all of these biases and heuristics that we know from behavioral science impact people's decision making. So the first is implicit over explicit. Wherever possible, we try to use implicit measures rather than just directly asking. And for this, for the case study I'm going to go over, I'll show you the implicit association task that we used. The other one is task over ask, and the idea here is wherever possible we want to measure the behavior. We want to actually observe the behavior we're interested in rather than asking about it. And as we've seen in the first talk, something like a video or a photo diary assignment works very well for this. Lastly, it's this idea of them over us, and what we mean here is rather than us giving our respondent a list of predefined attributes or factors that are important based on a certain product, we let them tell us what those attributes are. We let them generate that list, and we do so using our attribute elicitation task, which leverages the relative nature of decision making. So really quickly before moving on, I just want to stress for us it's more about these principles rather than the specific tools. For each of the principles, there's multiple tools we can use. These three tools that I'm going to talk about today just happen to be the ones that we used for the case study that I'll go over now. So we had a client that was a snack brand again, and they wanted to know how to move their brand away from the diet space and towards a more health space. They had 3 sub-flavor options within their master brand, and they also wanted to know which one of those was most related to the diet space. So the first part that we tackled was figuring out which of those sub-brands was most related to the diet space, and for this we used implicit associations. And why implicit associations work so well is because we're constantly making subconscious assessments of things in our environment, and we do so very quickly. So for those of you who may remember, this is hot or not, where you're essentially provided with a picture of someone and you swipe left or right to say if they're hot or not, very similar to today's version of Tinder. So if we were going to ask someone, which one of these people is hot, which one is not, they might pick the person on the left. And then when you ask them why, they'll tell you, oh, it's his lips, his eyes, all the typical things that would make somebody attractive. However, what it might just be is the person who's making that judgment at the time, their partner is wearing a plaid shirt and there's a plaid shirt in the background here. So there's all of these various implicit factors that influence our decision making that we won't be able to really articulate if we're just directly asked about it. So for our client, what we did is we used our implicit association task, and this is done over 5 phases, each of them very simple. We're just asking respondents to categorize image by swiping left or right into one of 2 categories. So for example, in the phase 1, they might be categorizing images into either the health or the diet category, in phase 2 into the apple or cookie category, and in phase 3 and phase 5 is where it gets interesting. And when we start matching those up. So we put diet and apple together in phase 3 or health and apple in phase 5. And if people see apple more in terms of health than diet, we'd expect them to be faster in phase 5 compared to phase 3. And so with these very small millisecond differences, we can get at where their implicit biases or associations lay. So when we compare this to this method of the implicit association task to directly asking, when we just ask respondents, of these 3 sub-brands, which one is the most, which one do you think is the most related to diet? They said they most often chose the lowest calorie option as being most related to diet, and of course it's a very rational answer. But using the implicit association task, what we were able to see, in fact, it wasn't the lowest calorie option. It was one of the other sub-brands that the packaging had a lot of strong cues that related to a previous diet campaign by this specific client. So by using the implicit association task, we were able to identify more accurately which of the flavors was associated with the diet space and create our strategy based on that. So the next thing we wanted to do was understand how consumers consumed the snack, how it fit into their day-to-day. And in thinking about how we would construct the study, one thing we know is what people say and do often don't align. So for example, all of the blue numbers here are these numbers represent how many people said they're going to engage in a certain behavior, and the pink ones represent how many people actually did. And what we can see very quickly from a glance is that the blue numbers are quite a bit larger than the pink numbers. So when we just ask someone, what are you going to do in the future, for all of those things that we went over in that first 7 subconscious factors, it's often not very reliable. It's not a good proxy to what they're actually going to do. Unfortunately, so you think, okay, if we can't ask them what they did in the future, perhaps we can ask them what they did in the past, but our memories are also not the most reliable. So for example, 1 in 6 Americans say that they definitely voted in the 2014 midterm elections, but that many Americans definitely did not vote in that election. And what's interesting here is they actually had an option for didn't vote, maybe vote, or definitely voted, and they chose definitely voted. And so again, this is not because people are necessarily being dishonest, but if you have a perception of yourself, you're a responsible citizen, you're politically engaged, so the schema or representation you have of yourself is of someone who is likely to vote, and their memories will actually just kind of be mapped onto that schema. So I'm the type of person who, typically votes, so yes, I voted in these last elections. So what we learned from this, that the takeaway is wherever possible, we want to measure the actual behavior we're interested in and not a weak proxy. And unfortunately, intentions and memory are fairly weak proxies for what behavior will actually be. So what we did is we just, over a series of 7 days, we had them take a photo or a video of themselves consuming the snack. And what's important about doing this over time is that, for the first 1 or 2 days, people can fake it and maybe, they present themselves in a more socially desirable way. But when you're asking someone to do something consistently over time, you tend to get a real picture of what's going on as time progresses on. And so this picture on the left here with the coffee mugs and the heart, this represents how they said they would consume. It's very romanticized and very ritualized, but the Cookie Monster is actually how they consumed from what we saw from the video and photo diaries. It was kind of anytime, any place, just get it in. What was interesting, though, there was one group, so the users of one specific sub-flavor did tend to consume more closely to how they said they did. So theirs was a little bit more ritualized. So what we were able to do is see how people wanted to consume and use the behavior of one of the actual groups to create a strategy for the client around this snack brand. Finally, there's this idea of them over us. So the client wanted to know, what attributes are most important to them when it comes to these snack brands. So there's things like, natural sweetener, real chocolate chips, low calorie, no artificial flavors. And these are the things that the client thought would be important in terms of health. And when you give clients a pre-assumed list, people are always going to respond as well as make a choice, but it's not necessary that what's in your set is actually what's most important. What we realized using our attributed elicitation task, which I'll go over on the next slide, is that what indicated health for them was more this idea that it's something that they would eat, but something that their kids wouldn't want to consume. It wasn't a cookie that their kids would have. And so how the attribute elicitation task works is that the first thing we do is we provide our respondents with what we call triplets. So there's 3 items that we three products or brands that we show them. One is the client and two competitors. And what's important about this is when they're at the point of sale, they're going to be presented with more options than just the client's brand. And so there are some attributes that might not even come about by looking at just that single brand, but it's not to say that these aren't important and will impact that point of sale. So for example here, if we're just considering instant coffee, we might think a lot about convenience or it being easy or the price. However, when we introduce the French press and the coffee maker, now this becomes more, we might think more about, you know, who's drinking these, the kind of social status of these different coffees, the taste, where the beans came from, etc. So, and when people are making decisions, these are all of the things that they're going to think about. So we use what we call these triplets, and all we ask them is which two are similar and which one is different and how. And so we're using still an implicit measure to get from them what's most important. We'll cycle through that about 5 or 6 times with different triplets, so client's brand, press, the different two competitors. And once we have the list of attributes now that has emerged from the client, then we ask them to rank them in terms of importance. And now the ranking is more meaningful because we know that the items in that ranking are actually important. Then we have the clients for each of the attributes that they've come up with. They benchmark the client's brand versus competitors. We can see strengths, weaknesses, and white spaces, and then we get some qualitative insights as to why the certain rankings came out as they did. And so when we use this task for our snack brand, what we realize is, you know, something that my kids wouldn't want to eat really came up in terms of indicating health to the consumers. Last thing, one thing that's really interesting here is after we let the consumers come up with their list of attributes, we also add in attributes that the client might be interested in that the consumers didn't list. And of the attributes that we put in from the client, none of those ranked in the top 5 for what was actually important to consumers. And you know, it's interesting because those would have been the only attributes that we had tested if we used a more traditional approach. So just to reiterate, I think this case study demonstrates is that when you're using traditional direct line inquiry research methods, rationalizations are what you're getting and not necessarily the motivations. But when we use a behavioral science framework where we use all of the knowledge from the behavioral sciences as to how people are actually making decisions and what is influencing those decisions, we get much closer to getting at the actual motivations for people's behaviors rather than just the rationalizations. Thank you so much.